Let's jump right into this explainer because today we are unpacking something you probably interact with every single day: the accidental victory of cow's milk. Seriously, think about your morning coffee or that bowl of cereal you had. Have you ever actually stopped to wonder why, out of all the animals on planet Earth, humanity just collectively decided to rely on the cow? Well, the truth is pretty wild. We mostly drink cow's milk because cows essentially won a biological, historical, and economic competition that they literally never even knew they entered. Okay, let's dive into this because to really get it, we have to look at milk from a totally alien perspective. When you think about it, we are adults drinking infant formula that evolution specifically tailored for a completely different animal, right? Milk evolved as the ultimate system for feeding mammalian offspring. Like, seal milk is incredibly fatty because pups need that quick insulation in the freezing cold. Rabbit milk is super concentrated. And cow's milk? Its one specific evolutionary goal is to help a calf become very large, very fast. Absolutely none of it evolved to be poured into our iced lattes. And for nearly all mammals, that relationship with milk ends completely at weaning. The baby animal moves on to an adult diet, the mother stops lactating, and that's the end of the story. Nobody's out there inventing yogurt in the wild. And early humans actually followed this exact same biological pattern. Babies produce lactase, which is the enzyme you need to digest lactose, but after childhood, that production naturally drops off. In fact, that remains the ancestral condition of humanity. For our ancient ancestors, chugging a glass of fresh milk would have been a total gastrointestinal emergency. We're talking severe cramps, bloating, just serious discomfort. But then something shifted in our genetics. We developed what is known as lactase persistence. This is a relatively recent evolutionary adaptation that allows some human adults to just keep producing that lactase enzyme well into adulthood. And what's really amazing about this is that it wasn't just a single freak genetic fluke. This trait actually evolved more than once. Different genetic variants popped up independently in Europe, East Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Basically, different global populations were facing similar survival pressures, and independently of each other, evolved the ability to digest milk. And this brilliantly illustrates how early humans actually managed to cheat biology. See, before widespread lactase persistence, our ancestors didn't just grit their teeth and tough it out with glasses of fresh milk. No, they used technology. Specifically, they let microbes eat the lactose first. By using fermentation, bacteria convert that lactose into lactic acid, which gives us sour milk and yogurt. Cheesemaking takes it a step further, separating the lactose-heavy whey from the curds. This was a massive game changer. Not only did it make dairy so much easier on the stomach, but it turned a liquid that spoils incredibly fast into energy-dense cheese and butter that could last longer and travel much farther. Which brings us to this mind-blowing realization about our history. Culture actually changed our biology. Humans created these dairy environments first. They leaned heavily on cheese and yogurt to act as a crucial food buffer when famines or droughts hit. And over time, in these specific environments that relied heavily on livestock, the humans who just so happened to have the genetic mutation to digest fresh milk, they had a massive survival advantage. It is a perfect, visible example of gene-culture coevolution. Literally, our cultural habit of making cheese drove our genetic mutations, not the other way around. So, all right, humans figured out how to consume dairy, but that still leaves a rather huge question. Why the cow? I mean, humanity definitely didn't gather around some prehistoric conference table, sample every mammal at an extremely dangerous beverage festival, and formally cast their votes, right? So how exactly did the cow end up becoming the absolute default? To understand this, we just have to look at the competition. Take goats, for example. Goats are fantastic. They tolerate dry, rocky landscapes effortlessly. But their milk yield per animal is pretty low. You would need a massive, complex bureaucracy just to manage a single city's goat milk supply. Then you have camels, which are absolutely incredible in hot, dry deserts, but they mature and reproduce very slowly. Water buffaloes, exceptional. They produce amazing, high-fat milk, but they're mostly concentrated in hot, wet regions like South Asia. The cow, however, sat right in the Goldilocks zone. Sure, they might not be the ideal choice for every single extreme environment out there, but they are incredibly adaptable, useful almost everywhere, and crucially, they are capable of producing massive amounts of milk. But beyond just milk, the cow really had an unbeatable resume. Think of it this way: a cow wasn't just a milk machine. It was a highly valuable, multi-purpose agricultural system on legs. It was basically a tractor that pulled plows. It acted as a mobile fertilizer factory for crops. It supplied hides and meat, and it performed the absolute biological miracle of converting grass, which humans cannot digest at all, into vital, nutrient-dense food. Having a herd of cattle was essentially like having a living, breathing bank account. Because they were so incredibly useful for all these other reasons, milking them just became this fantastic bonus feature. Getting that milk, though, not an easy task initially. Early cattle descended from oryx, which were giant, powerful, fast, and violently uncooperative wild bovines. Seriously, attempting to milk one of these things would have been a fantastic way to quickly exit the gene pool. So early milking required immense negotiation. Over many generations, humans had to carefully and selectively breed for calmer animals that would reliably let down their milk, eventually transforming this wild, dangerous beast into the manageable domestic cow that we recognize today. The cow's ultimate victory, though, really happened with the rise of cities. Urbanization completely separated everyday consumers from livestock. And remember, fresh milk is an excellent microbial habitat. It arrives warm and it spoils rapidly. So, as cities grew, they suddenly needed huge quantities of milk to be collected reliably, transported quickly, and kept cold. And the massive volume of milk produced by individual cows perfectly suited these new, highly centralized supply chains. Let's move along and see how this builds into an unstoppable industrial force. In the 1850s, railways dramatically expanded exactly how far milk could travel. Then, by the 1860s, pasteurization stepped in, reducing deadly pathogens through controlled heating. The 1880s brought us glass bottles, which brilliantly standardized retail sales, and by the 1900s, refrigeration completely transformed the timeline of spoilage. All of this rapid-fire infrastructure was custom-built from the ground up entirely around the biology and the output of the cow. This perfectly highlights a really fascinating economic concept known as path dependence. Basically, path dependence means something doesn't actually have to be the absolute only good option to dominate. It just needs an early advantage. Once factories were calibrated specifically for cow's milk, once milking machines were designed for cattle udders and veterinary systems focused entirely on dairy herds, the whole system was locked in. It's exactly why we still use the QWERT keyboard layout today. It was the early standard for typewriters. The QWERT keyboard understands this, and so does the cow. The infrastructure simply made any alternative far too expensive to adopt. From there, this dominant system went completely global. European colonial expansion carried cattle and dairy practices all over the world, which displaced or suppressed indigenous food systems in places like the Americas, Australia, and parts of Asia. Concurrently, massive institutional support really cemented the cow's elite status. Governments stepped in with heavy subsidies and price controls. Public health campaigns confidently and loudly linked cow's milk to national strength and sanitation. And of course, handing out those iconic little milk cartons in schools taught entire generations that drinking cow's milk was just a standard, civilized dietary requirement. But the dairy industry certainly didn't stop at just selling liquid in a glass. They learned to dismantle milk into a highly profitable, practically invisible ingredient system. They separated the liquid into fat and casein, converting those components into cream, butter, and identical slices of cheese. And whey? Well, whey was once considered a totally inconvenient byproduct, but they cleverly repurposed it into infant formula, protein powders, and baked goods. Cow's milk evolved into a standardized global commodity that now travels invisibly in processed foods way, way beyond the farm. Yet amidst all this expansion, it is super important to remember that cow's milk never actually became a universal biological need. Take East and Southeast Asia, for instance. Across much of those regions, lactase persistence remains relatively uncommon even today. But those societies built incredibly sophisticated, thriving cuisines